You can't replace part of the brain. Like, you
treat them the same.
The source of truth for the medtech industry.
Coexists with the prophets.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the medtech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the 90s, built $1 billion company that held up high, a lot of things.
State of MedTech. With your host, Omar M. Khatib. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm joined today by Bill Hunter, who's the president and CEO of Canary Medical, a smart digital implant company. One of the things that we've noticed in the med device space is that you can't move forward as a company innovatively and also from a funding standpoint by just having a dumb device. There's more of a need for data, and more importantly, that translates to better care for the patient. So Bill has a very fantastic and interesting company. I had to have him on the show. So Bill, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Maybe before we talk about Canary and the problem you guys are solving, maybe give us a little bit of background on yourself. Like, how did you end up in this great industry of ours?
Yeah, totally by accident is the honest answer. I'm a doc by training, and that was actually all I ever wanted to be. But when I was finishing up medical school, I'd been working on a research project, and to make a very long story short, that project ended up turning into drug-coated stents, and I started a company called Angiotech, which developed what ultimately became the Taxa stent and paclitaxel delivery balloons and the Zilver peripheral drug-coated stent. And that product went on to capture 70% of the global stent market. So the little company went from a tiny thing to a very big thing with thousands of employees and many millions in sales. And so that consumed my medical career. So I spent the first 22 years working in interventional cardiology, and then spent the rest of my life working in medtech after that. And Canary came after Angiotech. So that was my career journey, my accidental foray into medtech.
That's amazing. And just out of curiosity, when you build something like Angiotech, which was a great success, what were some of the biggest lessons you got as a founder from there that you brought over to Canary? Because we have a lot of first-time founders who listen to the show. Yeah. So I'm wondering what sort of words of advice and insights you have from that time.
That's a really good question. I started Angiotech when I was in my late 20s. And so I was CEO in quotation marks when I was 29 years old. And I'm now 61. So I've been doing the same job for 32 years. In that first entrepreneurial peak, it's really all accidental learning. And so I would encourage people to just go with it. You don't really know what you're doing, and that may be as much of an asset as it is a hindrance. You don't really know what to expect. And I think the best thing you can do at that point in time is just follow your passion and follow your interest and follow your scientific inclinations, and really just trust the training and judgment at that point in your career. Because usually when you're young, that's when your technical peaks are at their highest and your fluid intelligence is at its maximum. So I think you just let it happen to you. I started Canary when I was 49. So it was complete opposite end of my career. And I think in that situation, you can do it more by design. You have enough contacts. I had people I knew. I had people I'd worked with for 20, 25 years that I could bring in along. I knew what I didn't know at that point in my life, and I could be much more systematic and much more organized and much more deliberate in how we formed the company. And so a totally different experience. And at that point, your memory is more crystalline at that point. And so you rely more on experience and judgment. But I think when you first start out, the best advice I can give people is the opposite of what they tell you in all the self-help books. Just go with it and let it happen and use it as the way to learn on the fly.
I love that. I think it's also great life advice as well. As a new entrepreneur myself, I feel like a lot of the lessons I get end up translating to life itself. And I think one of the biggest ones is the obstacle becomes the way, and that nobody really knows what they're doing. And once you accept things as part of the journey, you start focusing less on this end goal and end results. Things just seem to take care of themselves and the results come. But when you start putting all this focus and pressure on it, that's when things just for some reason gets harder. It's like very counterintuitive, but it just feels like that's how it works for a lot of things.
I agree. And I'd actually go one step further on that and say that if you actually knew what was in front of you when you're younger, starting thing, you probably wouldn't do it. right? If you think about what's involved in running a med tech business, you got to raise a lot of money, you got to do corporate partnerships, you got to build a board and deal with VCs, and you've got to build manufacturing and go through the FDA and all stuff that you just haven't been trained to do. And if you looked at that in its entirety, you'd say, you know what, I'm going to be a doc. Like, this is way too much of a diversion from where I wanted to spend my life. But part of the beauty of it is when you get into it and it just happens to you, you learn it. It's fed to you step by step. It's a life MBA as opposed to a true education. And I think that's really wonderful. And in fact, the hardest problem you have when you're older is that you know exactly what's in front of you, and that makes you less likely to take it on again because too much knowledge is almost a hindrance. So I agree with you. I think sometimes that just the absence of knowing where things are going is your greatest asset when you first start out.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I think one of the more famous clips since NVIDIA hit their $1 trillion market cap, there's all these like old clips of Jensen, and one of the clips that came out was like, I think like he's at a startup event and the guy asked him like, yeah, what's your advice to founders? And Jensen, don't do it. And the guy laughed. He thought he was joking. He's like, no, I'm being serious. If we knew like how humiliating it would be and difficult and everything, like we really wouldn't do it and stuff. Yeah. I think, I don't know, we were talking about getting inspired by those who've done like really great things. I was down in Miami playing golf at this course. It has a $1.2 million initiation fee. Right. And the guy who invited me, he runs a hedge fund, and he made this comment to me. He's like, I have a problem with the fact that entrepreneurship is everywhere. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's not everybody's supposed to be an entrepreneur, nor can they be. I just feel like it's getting pushed. And I agree. I feel like the winners and the success stories are always over amplified, and we never talk about the losers or like the failures and everything. And I feel like that's like always missing.
And so that's the far more common journey, right?
100%. So after Angiotech having you spent a lot of time there, you had a nice exit from there. You technically didn't have to do something else, but you decided to. So what was the problem that kept you up at night? And you said that there has to be a better way. And how did that lead to the start of Canary?
Yeah, in a strange way, I think I've done the same thing for my entire career, even though it may seem like two very different things. They're actually similar in one way. Angiotech was based on the fact that medical devices failed, and they failed because they got infected or they got inflamed or they didn't heal correctly. And pharmaceutical companies made these wonderful molecules called anti-infectives and anti-inflammatories. And the concept was, why don't you put these together? You could add biology to an inert implant, and you could make that implant function at a much higher level. And Angiotech was successful because we took the failure rate of bare metal stents from 20-30% down to 1-2% by using biology instead of engineering. Anyways, fast forward 20 something years. The Canary insight was very similar. It's this thing can orient itself in 3 space. It can do my heart rate. It can keep track of where I am. It can count my steps. It can do all these kinds of things. And it seemed absurd that this medical hardware that goes into millions of people doesn't provide any feedback whatsoever. And so it really was taking sensor technology and applying it to medical device problems. It was going outside of traditional med tech, in the first case using bioactives or drugs, and the second case using sensors, but trying to solve mechanical problems with non-traditional, non-mechanical solutions. And in many ways, the business models of the companies were very similar. And quite frankly, the difficulties with both companies were similar. So.
Got it. And so that started you towards this process of developing essentially, correct me if this is the wrong way to categorize it, a smart knee implant, correct?
That was the first embodiment. When we sat down at Angiotech, we said, hey, if you're going to put one drug on a heart valve, what would it be and why would you do it? If you're going to put one drug on a coronary stent, what would it be and why would you do it? And it turned out that stents were the first embodiment, and that's what we were known for. The same is really true at Canary. We didn't look at this. We're not really an orthopedics company at all. We sat down and said, hey, if you're going to put something on a heart valve or a stent graft or a knee or a hip or shoulder, what would you want to know? What would the clinician want to know? What would the information that they would need to manage their patients? What would they like that device to tell them? And that was where we started. And The vision of the company, the intellectual property portfolio of the company is actually quite broad. It's really based across many different implants. But it turned out that the first embodiment was a knee. And so that's what we're most known for. But we didn't wake up and decide to be a knee company. We became a knee company because that's what we were able to do. Since then, we've been able to develop other programs along behind it. But Persona IQ is really the flagship product of the company.
Got it. And it feels like, at least from what I know about the company, again, and I will get into it in a moment, which is earlier this year, you guys talked to announce this focus now, moving from the knee to the heart. But it feels, again, you guys have a great name. If for those who don't know, you use a canary in the coal mine to go and check whether it's safe or not. And so it feels like what you guys really are is a sensor company that happens to be in medtech. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I think that our most valuable contribution is the data that we collect, right? Putting a smart stem onto a Persona knee, which looks like that, right? That doesn't make the knee any better. Right? Zimmer makes a great knee. The Persona knee works really well because engineers designed it to work well. And normally this stem is solid metal. And with us, it's got a bunch of electronics in it that collect data and transmit. But that stem doesn't make the knee any better. So we're not a device company that makes things, that in the traditional sense where the device is better. What happens is we generate data that allows us to manage the patient better and get the patient have a superior outcome that they wouldn't have if we didn't have that data. So back to your initial point, it's not really the med tech at all that is the innovation. It's the creation and accumulation of novel data that can be used to help clinicians in a way that historically they haven't been able to before.
So now with this focus on the heart, what is a clinician essentially getting that they didn't have before? And what are you hoping that they do with it? Because I think the big thing about data is not necessarily what are you going to learn, but more importantly, what actions are you going to take after you see the data, right?
So I mentioned at the beginning that I was trained as a physician, and I think I will always think that way. And so when we go to design any product, the concept that we start with is, all right, I need to monitor this patient. I need to know what's going on with this patient. How would I do that if I didn't have a sensor system? So in the knee, how does an orthopedic surgeon monitor a post-operative patient? They watch them walk, right? And they take their knee and they put it through a range of motion, and that's what they do clinically. And they use that knowledge and their clinical skills to evaluate whether they're healing okay, whether they're walking okay, and whether they're functioning okay. So that device collects all kinds of parameters on step count, cadence, stride length. So how are you walking? What's your gait look like? And then it provides range of motion continuously back to see how well the knee is bending and how well the patient's functioning. So fast forward to cardiology, if I'm looking at a patient who's had a new heart valve or who's had in congestive heart failure or whatever, and I was examining that patient, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to put a stethoscope onto their chest. I'm going to listen to their heart valve sounds to see if they have a murmur and to see how significant that murmur is. I'm going to put my stethoscope on their back and I'm going to listen to them breathe so I can tell whether or not they have fluid in their lungs, and if they do, whether that's mild or severe, and have an assessment of their volume and their cardiac function. In the cardiac monitor that we build, we do that. So it has ECG and other things like other monitors, but it also has high fidelity acoustics. And so we can listen to the heart valves. And because it's identify, for example, that it's mitral regurg, but by the amplitude of that signal, we can tell whether it's mild, moderate, or severe because we can quantify it. As a digital signal, we can quantify it. As a clinician, you just have to know it and listen for it to quantify it, but we can actually do that. And then similarly, we can hear the lungs and we can hear the crackles in the lungs, and we can quantify the fluid volume. So I think of it like we've got this little clinical evaluation mini clinician inside the body wandering around that's going to provide that information continuously in real time. So it's not just going to be one examination, it's going to be a continuous flow of the same type of clinical information that a physician would want if they were going to evaluate the patient in their office.
That's fantastic. And you guys had a successful first-in-human trial earlier this year for this implant. What does it look like? It talks about how this is, and at least in the news that I read, that aside from essentially listening to these murmurs and issues, but the interesting side of it is that there's a pharmaceutical approach about how do certain drugs impact and improve like patients with like congestive heart failure.
Right.
For what does the patient profile look for this? What is that? What's the size of that market more or less? And then what's the process for the patient like in the future to go and get one of these? Like what if can you like sort of.
Sure. So your earlier question was really quite on point. So in and of itself is not a value. It's data collection that leads to a clinical decision that's of value, right? So if we collect all this data, but nobody looks at it and nobody changes the therapy in the patient, then it's just a really expensive way to provide more meaningless information to the clinician. So the point of it is that you serve as your own baseline. Whatever metric you're looking at, you serve as your own baseline. And so by monitoring continuously all day, all along, we can see even subtle changes if you're starting to deteriorate. So you don't have to wait until that patient is already in severe heart failure, right? I spent the first part of my career spending a lot of time in the emergency room, and you don't want that heart failure patient coming in when they're already, fluid overloaded and, having a tough time breathing and in, not great shape. What you want to do is have that heart failure patient and see that they're starting to head down that slippery slope, send a notification to the clinician who can then make an intervention preemptively. Say, I'm going to increase their diuretics, for example, and I'm going to try and nip this in the bud before they end up with something more severe. Just like on our knee program, if the patient's knee is not moving as well as it should, we can tell the clinician, hey, this patient needs more PT. They need to go through a more range of motion before they get a frozen joint and they're not able to move it appropriately. So the data in of itself is useless unless you have a way of quantifying it. You notify the clinician of the problem, and then there is a reasonable and simple intervention that can correct it. And in cardiovascular, that's typically changing the medications of the patient or adjusting dosage or whatever you might need to do to titrate them appropriately.
Got it. So when it turns to who's going to be the one essentially inserting the implants, like that'll be the one. I think the big thing is on the continuum of care, who's implementing it, who's consuming that data. And then more important, I don't want to say more importantly, but on the business model side is like, right. How do the providers and hospitals essentially make money from this?
Yeah. Let me chunk that down. So on who's going to be inserting it, and it's going to be, in all likelihood, the cardiologist. Our device goes in sub-Q, so it just goes under the skin on the chest wall. It's very simple.
Would it be an interventional cardiologist, or since it's subcutaneous, could it be any cardiologist?
It could be any cardiologist. It's an in-office.
Okay, so that opens up your market then.
Yep.
That's great.
It's an in-office procedure. You make a small nick in the skin, you slide it under the skin, and steri-strip it, and you're done.
That's fantastic. And the reason why I like that, Bill, sorry to interrupt you, is that especially for investors who are listening, for a lot of people, when you hear implant, you're thinking it's very invasive and everything. But the fact that this is subcutaneous, so instead of interventional cardiologists, which I think in the United States, I'm going off the top of my head, there's maybe 5 to 10K of them, versus cardiologists in general, like there's 40 or 50,000. There's a lot more.
Yep.
So you have scale there, a larger market. And the fact that this is an in-office procedure means that you could do a lot of these. So I would imagine since subcutaneous, you can do this within like probably under 30 minutes.
Oh, probably under 3. If you've ever come across the Link system by Medtronic, the cardiac monitoring system, there's an applicator and you just basically almost inject it under the skin through a small nick. That's all it takes to do it. And that's the same for us. The kind of gold standard for cardiac monitoring is pulmonary artery pressure. We're able to do that acoustically and mathematically. Right now, it requires a sensor to be actually in the pulmonary artery, which is a much more invasive interventional cardiology type procedure. But we're able to do that from outside the thoracic cavity from sub-Q. So that's hopefully our major advancement forward, is not having to instrument more invasively.
That makes sense. And then once it's implemented, how does a physician get access to the data? Is it something that the patient has to come in for? Can they access it remotely? What does the management of that patient look like?
Yeah, the thing that surprises everybody when we talk about our actual technology is that the pacemaker batteries have become so good and the power draw from sensors are so low. For example, our smart knee, we can collect 10, 20 years of data from the patient with nothing for them to wear or charge, which most people find quite surprising. With the sub-Q placement and running it 24 hours a day, which we don't do for knee patients, that battery is probably only going to last 3 years. But still, you're talking about a device that would only need to be replaced fairly infrequently and fairly non-invasively. So there's enough power there to do that monitoring nonstop. The patient has, typically they have a base station that sits in their bedroom, and it acts as the relay from the device to the cloud. So every night the device downloads that day's worth of data to the base station. The base station sends it to a secure cloud, and then all the data and analytics are done overnight. And the next morning, the doctor and the patient are looking at yesterday's data. If you transmit it in real time continuously, you'd go through a lot more power. You wouldn't be able to do it it wouldn't last as long. But in most cases, what you're looking for is day-to-day trends. You're not looking for minute-to-minute changes. It isn't detecting ventricular fibrillation or something where you need to act immediately. You're looking at longer-term trends in function. And
when you talk about trends, what do those trends look like? What are they specifically looking at? And when they spot said trend, what's the action that's taken after?
You'd be looking at, for example, rising pulmonary artery pressure, or you'd be looking at an increase in fluid in the lungs, which would suggest that your patient's heading into congestive heart failure and getting progressively worse. That would be a situation, again, where you'd adjust their medications to try and bring them back into line. The analogy I always use is what we do is almost like CGM for other indications, right? So I call
think glucose monitoring.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
Call our knee. I call it CGM for orthopedic surgeons, right? Historically, what they did was they would get a single measurement by examining the patient. Now they get many measurements in a row. And initially, what you can do is you can see not just where the patient is, but where they're trending, right? We were talking about stocks and public companies a little earlier. You wouldn't ever buy a stock based on a single stock quote. You want to see whether the trend is up or down or flat or whatever. That's the value of continuous data. You get context of where the patient is and what their trajectory is. And so by doing that, hopefully you get tighter control. So by doing that in orthopedics, hopefully you can identify the patients who are doing poorly, and you can alter and increase their activity and physiotherapy and whatever it takes to get them more mobile and get them better off. Same is true for a cardiovascular patient. You want to identify the patient that is trending in the wrong direction, because it's far easier to correct that than it is to deal with it when it's already happened, right? You don't want to wait until they're already in the emergency room to take corrective action. You don't want to wait until the joint is so stiff that you need a scalpel to loosen it up. You want to identify that when it's very early on, and you can just maneuver the joint and get it back to normal. Same is true in cardiovascular. You want to identify that patient before they get into trouble, maybe even before they have symptoms, and let them and titrate their fluid balance so that they don't get into trouble in the first place, which is exactly what we do with diabetics. We don't wait until they're in ketoacidosis before we act, right? When we see the trend, we titrate and we keep them in that nice normal area and never let them get too high or too low. That's the object of CGM. I think of fluid balance the same way. We don't want them to get too high. We don't want them to get fluid overload. We want to use that to keep them in that ideal band and prevent the complication from getting more significant, because hospitalization in those patients is tremendously expensive.
Yeah, and I think probably the most interesting trend right now in medicine is the idea of getting to a point of more predictive medicine. And in order to predict, you have to have data ahead of time. So you get certain, and I think what's interesting, again, you're a clinician. For me, I'm not a clinician. I did go to medical school and I left about halfway through. Yep. But when you look at Harrison's internal medicine or Robin's pathology and everything, physicians never had access to this amount of data in real time. And so that's going to change a lot of guidelines and improve things because, look, perfect example with the continuous glucose monitor. If you told me 10 years ago that people were going to be paying cash for that and who are not diabetics, I would have been like, there's no way. But here we are, people are doing that, including all these other testing companies to personalize medicine, right?
Yes.
And so I think the only way to get to personalized medicine, which you have optimal health, is really precise continuous data per patient.
I couldn't agree with you more. And just to pile on that point, it's not just that patients want data, they want their data, right? So if you think about it, most of medicine is population medicine. So you look at a data set and I'm normal or abnormal based on population data. I'm high or low, whether I'm looking at a blood test, an x-ray, it doesn't really matter. It's if I do a clinical trial and I respond to a drug, I'm just part of the population that responded or didn't respond. Any drug doesn't work in everybody. It works in some subsegment. And for the other people, it does absolutely nothing. If I'm taking a drug, I want to be in the population that it's actually working for, right? And so that's where the personalization comes. If I'm having a therapeutic intervention, I want to see my data. I want to see if I'm offside or normal. I don't care what the population normal is. I care what I'm at today. Do I need to increase my activity, or do I need to increase my diuretic, or what do I need to do to stay normal? And that is really where it's going. And without continuous data and without personalized data, that's really hard to do. We're moving from where as clinicians, we all made decisions based on population norms and devices and surgeries that were kind of tested on broad populations, which we then generalized as a standard of care, to now looking at how do I deliver the best care to this particular patient. And there's just no way to do that without some sort of monitoring data. Now, we're a long way from that. We're not there yet, but I think over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see that accelerate in an incredible way.
No, completely. And just as we kind of wrap things up, a couple questions I have for you. So one is, what does the total addressable market look like for this cardiac space roughly? I'd say in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, depending on who you read, 6% of the population over 60 has some sort of level of heart failure. You throw in people who've had valvular heart disease and people who have coronary artery disease. It's a pretty substantive part of the population. Cardiovascular has always been MedTech's biggest market.
Yeah. And I think I'll make a prediction here, and this is why I'm excited for Canary, is that I would say maybe the generation above me, which is, I think, is Gen X, and then my generation, I'm a millennial, and then the ones below us, the Gen Zs, is that getting more interested in health and getting more interested in data and interventions earlier on. So for me, I'm only 38 years old. I have a family history of diabetes, right?
Yep.
I went and paid cash for a continuous glucose monitor because I was just curious. I just wanted to get some data.
Sure.
Right. And so I'm wondering if I feel like there is a future, as crazy as it sounds, that if somebody has a family history of congestive heart failure, for example, that whether it's their insurance company or they just do cash pay and get one of these devices implanted just for a year or two, but starting at an earlier age, like in their 30s, they're recommending if you have a family history of colon cancer, you don't wait till you're like 45 or 50 to get your first colonoscopy. Like, you should do it in your 30s.
Right. And I think we're going to see more and more of that across all kinds of different parts of medicine. I'll give you just a crazy example of that, where I didn't even fully appreciate the value of data and what I thought was unrelated data. So we've now got 12 billion data points collected from how people recover from knee surgery. And so the object of that exercise, of course, was to help people recover from knee surgery. But if you pull out your old Harrison's textbook of medicine, you'll find out that there's over 100 diseases that manifest themselves with gait abnormalities, right? Parkinson's disease, MS, stroke, right? Lumbar disc disease. It goes on and on. Diabetes, heart failure. You can diagnose heart failure by stroke. I worked with by gait. I worked with some very good emerge docs who could see a patient walk in the front door and do the diagnosis just by their posture and how they were walking. Anyways, fast forward, how you walk tells a lot about how healthy you are, right? How fast you walk, how active you are. It's actually a very important health indicator. You need an intact muscular system, neurological system, cardiovascular system to walk upright and move around. Now we have a gait monitoring system that's accurate enough to tell if you're developing gait changes. Maybe you're developing Parkinson's or dementia or congestive heart failure. So here we were setting out to develop a knee product. And I think within the very near future, we're going to be able to tell if a patient's at risk for heart failure or something else, because that becomes a health indicator. So fast forward on the cardiac side, when you start to have these indicators and you start to have these trends and you have enough mathematics and you have enough computing power, you're absolutely right. You go from diagnosis to prediction, which is that, hey, this is subclinical, but I've seen this pattern before. And if it continues on the way that it's going, I'm going to have a clinical problem in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever the case may be. And so I think what we're going to find is that all these data streams are going to give us a better and better picture of the overall health of the human being. And it's going to give us the ability to diagnose things even beyond maybe what we initially anticipated they were for. Why do we take blood pressure and pulse and respiratory rate in every patient? Because they're good indicators of overall health. A lot of the things that we're collecting may end up being indicators of overall health.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And like last question for you is more on the commercial side. Anytime a company makes a pivot into a new product area, a new clinical need, it's difficult, right? And in your case, it's not like you're going from like knees to shoulders, you're going knees to cardiac, which is a completely different thing. How do you navigate that as a company? What on the commercial side, what are you guys thinking about, both on the targeting, the marketing, and more importantly, like the brand of Canary?
First, yes, it's a departure, but 50% of our company is about collecting data, analyzing data, interpreting data, and providing clinical feedback. Whole system, which cost $150 million to develop and set up, that whole system is somewhat agnostic to where the data comes from. It doesn't matter whether it came from a knee or a shoulder or cardiac. That whole system for the collection, analysis, and interpretation, surprisingly, is able to do that independent. Where it differs, of course, is in the delivery of care model. But even that has more similarities than you would think. And this is an obvious statement, but one that I think medtech people don't think about much, which is that it costs far more to care for a patient than it costs to create a patient. Right? So when you put a knee replacement into a human being, that costs Medicare about $5 billion a year. But it costs them $15 billion to look after that patient after they get the knee replacement, right? When you have a cardiac patient, to put in a stent or deal with their ischemia is expensive, but dealing with them after that is much, much more expensive. And in medtech, because we're very much procedural oriented, we tend to think about that first market. What's the knee market? What's the stent market? What's the pacemaker market? But the patient management market invariably is much, much bigger. And so while we go in on a device, we're attached to a device, really we're in the patient management market. And that really is all about identifying outliers, notifying the clinician, and helping them take therapeutic interventions. And that's really the expertise that we built. The other part of it is, I don't deny, is different, but it's not like we're waking up and we're going to go compete with Edwards on heart valves or Boston Scientific on stents or Medtronic on pacemakers. We're not going to do that. We're going to take cardiovascular data and help clinicians manage their heart patients better, which is not really something that is being done by a competitor per se. It gives us a bit of a green field to go into.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're absolutely right. I never thought of it like that, but you're absolutely right about the patient management side, which we actually don't hear a lot about, to be honest with you. Maybe it's because it's not as sexy as a procedural side. As the saying goes, sometimes just if you follow the money, you'll find the truth. And aside from an investment opportunity, there's also a lot of problems there, right? And I think that if we look at the GDP of healthcare, one would argue that's the side where a lot of waste is occurring. And I think that's like a great opportunity for innovation.
Right. Just to finish that point, I think the reason people don't think of it as a market is that people can say, all right, how many stents were sold and who sold how many of them? It's a very easy number to get to. But managing a cardiac patient, that's hospitalizations, it's drugs, it's interventions, it's emergency room visits, it's home care. It's a grab bag of stuff, right? It's a lot of different things. And that's hard to put that into a market. You can look at it and say, okay, this is a $50 billion problem, but that's made up of 20 or 30 disparate markets that behave independently, from clinical services to hospital stays. And so it doesn't lend itself to the same type of analysis that investors typically do. And for example, in our knee, we don't go in and say, we're going to impact the knee market. We say, we're going to take the cost of managing that patient from $15,000 down to $10,000. And if we do, that's not going to happen by doing one thing. It's going to reduce the number of MRIs or X-rays or ER visits or, hospitalizations, that type of thing. So the same is true. You're actually not really going after a targeted market. You're going after taking bricks and mortar type interventions and turning them into less expensive virtual interventions that, save time and money and the cost of being in a hospital.
Nah, it makes complete sense. And Bill, thank you. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I know you're active on LinkedIn, so I'm going to tell people to follow you also because you have such great, again, I like to call them musings on startup life and everything. They hit so well. But for the clinicians and any investors or VCs who are listening, go check out Canary at their website, canary.com. And that being said, I'm your host, Omar Khatib. If you haven't done it already, be sure to subscribe to the show. We're the number one show in medtech for a reason, and give us a 5-star review. We'll see you all next time. Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who'd really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.